Those shoes don't belong in a room like this. The sentence landed softly, almost politely, but it cut through the ballroom harder than a slammed door. At the center of the Langford Grand Hotel in Atlanta, beneath chandeliers bright enough to make every glass of water sparkle like crystal, 9-year-old Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still. The music had been floating through the room only seconds before. A smooth piano melody wrapped around the quiet clink of silverware and the low hum of wealthy people pretending not to watch one another. Now all of it seemed to pause. A waiter stopped beside a table with a tray of lemon tarts balanced in one hand. A woman in pearls lowered her champagne glass. Two teenagers near the dessert wall looked down at Naomi's feet, then quickly looked away, embarrassed by their own curiosity. Naomi's shoes were old. There was no hiding that. Brown leather, creased across the toes, the left sole repaired with careful white stitching that did not match, the laces two different shades because one had snapped weeks ago and her grandmother had replaced it with whatever she could find in a kitchen drawer. They were polished as much as old shoes could be polished, but no amount of care could make them look like the glossy black loafers and satin heels moving across the marble floor around her. Naomi had known people would notice. She just had not expected the first person to say it out loud to be Harrison Whitmore. Everyone in Atlanta knew that name. Harrison Whitmore owned hotels, apartment towers, office parks, and enough land across Georgia to make mayors return his calls before breakfast. He was 62, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a midnight blue tuxedo that looked as if it had been stitched directly onto his confidence. He stood near the front row of the gala seating, one hand resting on a polished cane he did not really need, the other tucked neatly at his side. Behind him, a gold sign read the Whitmore Children's Future Foundation, and beneath those words, in smaller letters, a night to honor tomorrow's leaders. Naomi had been invited as one of those tomorrow's leaders. Her essay had won second place in a citywide student writing contest, and tonight she was supposed to read it before the scholarship announcement. Her grandmother, Grace Brooks, had pressed Naomi's blue dress that morning with a towel over the fabric so the iron would not leave marks. She had braided Naomi's hair into neat rows and fastened the ends with tiny white beads that clicked softly whenever Naomi turned her head. Before they left their small apartment in Decatur, Grace had crouched by the door, tied those old shoes one more time, and said, "Baby, don't let anybody make you feel small in a place God let you walk into." Naomi had believed her. She still did. But belief did not stop the heat from rising into her cheeks when Harrison Whitmore's eyes moved from her shoes to her face with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for cracked glass or spilled coffee. "Mr. Whitmore," Grace said, her voice gentle but tight, "my granddaughter was invited to speak tonight." Harrison gave Grace a brief glance, not cruel enough to shout, not kind enough to soften. "I'm sure she was," he replied. "But there are standards at events like this. Presentation matters. Donors notice everything." The word donors slid across the marble like ice. Naomi felt her grandmother's hand touch her shoulder, light and protective. Around them, the silence thickened. The people closest to Harrison did what people often do when power behaves badly. They waited to see whether they were supposed to laugh. One man in a gray suit gave a tiny smile and then swallowed it. A woman at the next table adjusted her diamond bracelet as if it had suddenly become fascinating. Naomi looked down at her shoes. For a second, all she could see were Grace's hands from that morning, dark fingers working the frayed laces, thumbs smoothing the repaired leather with almost sacred care. Those shoes had carried Naomi 6 blocks to school when the bus pass ran out. They had stood in grocery lines, library aisles, church basements, and the waiting room of a free clinic when Grace's cough would not go away. They had stepped around puddles and broken sidewalk glass, and still made it to every spelling test on time. Old, yes. Useless, no? Naomi lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it did not shake. "My grandma fixed them so I could come here." The room seemed to lean toward her. Harrison's expression barely changed, but something sharpened in his eyes. He was not used to children answering back without being rude. He was not used to anyone poor standing in front of him with dignity instead of apology. "And what exactly," he asked, the corner of his mouth lifting, "did those shoes bring you here to do?" Grace inhaled softly. Naomi heard it. She also heard the soft buzz of a phone recording somewhere behind her. The distant hiss of the hotel fountain beyond the glass doors, the tiny click of her own white beads as she turned fully toward the billionaire. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not ask to be forgiven for arriving in the only shoes she had. To speak, sir, Naomi said. Not to be laughed at. A small sound passed through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper, but something alive. Harrison blinked once. For the first time since Naomi had entered the ballroom, his confidence did not fill every inch of space around him. Near the front table, a little boy with soft blonde hair and a navy suit too stiff for his shoulders looked up from his plate. Oliver Whitmore, Harrison's 6-year-old grandson, had been quiet all evening, watched over by adults who corrected his posture, wiped his hands, and reminded him not to wander. But now his eyes were fixed on Naomi, not on her shoes the way everyone else had looked, but on her face. He saw the way she stood there, small in the middle of a room built to impress people, refusing to disappear. Harrison noticed his grandson watching and cleared his throat. "Confidence is admirable," he said, turning slightly so the nearby guests could hear him again. "But confidence alone does not earn a place on that stage." Naomi felt Grace's fingers tighten, just a little. The stage waited at the far end of the ballroom, dressed in navy curtains and white roses, the microphone standing beneath a spotlight like a question. Naomi's essay was folded in the pocket of her dress. She could feel the paper against her side, warm from her own nervous hand. Harrison looked toward the event coordinator, then back at Naomi. His smile was calm now, controlled, almost generous in a way that made the room colder. "If Miss Brooks was invited to speak," he said, "then let her speak. Let the room decide whether she belongs here." Everyone understood what he meant. It was not an invitation. It was a test. A polished, public, perfectly legal kind of humiliation wrapped in opportunity. Grace leaned down close to Naomi's ear and whispered, "We can go home, baby. You don't owe these people anything." Naomi looked again at the stage, at the microphone, at the rows of faces waiting to see whether she would shrink. Then she looked at her grandmother, whose best dress was 10 years old but spotless, whose feet ached from working hotel laundry shifts long before men like Harrison owned the buildings. Naomi touched the worn toe of one shoe against the marble, feeling how cold and smooth the floor was beneath her. "No, Grandma," she whispered back. "You fixed them so I could come here." Then she turned toward Harrison Whitmore and said, clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "I'll speak." The chandelier light trembled across the marble as Naomi took her first step toward the stage, her old shoes making the smallest sound in the room. Yet somehow, it was the only sound anyone heard. Naomi walked slowly, not because she was afraid, but because every step felt like it belonged to her grandmother, too. The marble floor of the Langford Grand Hotel stretched ahead of her like a river of white stone, shining beneath the chandeliers, reflecting the small brown shoes that half the room had decided were unworthy before hearing a single word from the child wearing them. Behind her, Grace Brooks stood with one hand pressed lightly against her own chest, as though she were holding her breath in place. Harrison Whitmore remained near the front row, his face composed, his cane angled against the polished floor, his silver hair perfect under the lights. To most people, he looked calm. To Naomi, he looked like a locked door. The guests shifted as she passed. Some tried to smile now, embarrassed by the silence they had helped create. Others stared into their programs, pretending they had not enjoyed the moment when Harrison had turned a child into a lesson about standards. Naomi noticed all of it. She noticed the woman in pearls who had looked at her shoes first and her face second. She noticed the man in the gray suit who had almost laughed and now would not meet her eyes. She noticed the event coordinator standing beside the stage steps with a clipboard clutched so tightly the paper bent. But she did not stop. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity was not a feeling. It was a decision you made while people were trying to take it from you. When Naomi reached the stage, the microphone looked taller than it had from across the room. The spotlight was warm on her forehead. She could smell roses, candle wax, expensive perfume, and the faint lemon polish from the grand piano near the wall. The room blurred for a second, not from tears, but from brightness. Then she touched the folded paper in her dress pocket and remembered Grace at the kitchen table, saying, "Read it like you are telling the truth, not asking for permission." Naomi unfolded the essay. The paper made a small crackling sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. She stood on her toes to reach the microphone, but before she could speak, Harrison's voice came from below. "You may adjust the stand," he said, almost kindly, though something in the tone made several guests glance at him. Naomi looked down. "Thank you, sir," she said. The event coordinator hurried forward and lowered the microphone. Naomi waited, hands folded over the paper, eyes steady. That waiting did something strange to the room. It made the adults feel the weight of their own impatience. It made Oliver Whitmore sit up straighter at the front table, his small hands wrapped around the edge of his chair. Vivian Whitmore, his mother, leaned toward him and whispered for him to sit properly, but Oliver barely heard her. He was watching Naomi's shoes again, not with judgment this time, but with wonder. They had crossed the whole room after his grandfather said they did not belong. That seemed important to him. Naomi took one breath, then another, and began. "My name is Naomi Brooks. I am 9 years old. My essay is called What My Grandmother Taught Me About Tomorrow." Her voice was soft at first, and somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a spoon touched a plate. She looked up, not angry, just present. The sound stopped. "My grandmother says tomorrow is not something rich people own and poor people wait for. Tomorrow is something we build with what we have." Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Harrison shifted his cane from one hand to the other. Naomi continued, stronger now. "Some people think old things are embarrassing. Old houses, old dresses, old cars, old shoes. But my grandmother says old things can carry proof. Proof that someone cared enough to repair instead of throw away. Proof that something survived." A few heads turned toward Harrison, quickly, quietly, then away. He did not move, but his jaw tightened. Naomi did not look at him. She looked at the paper, then at the room. "These shoes are old because my grandmother chose rent before sneakers. She chose groceries before ribbons. She chose schoolbooks before anything pretty. Every time the sole opened, she stitched it back because she said my feet still had places to go." The words settled slowly, like dust in sunlight. No one smiled now. The ballroom had changed temperature without the air conditioning moving at all. Naomi could feel it, the way people stopped watching her as a curiosity and started listening to her as a person. She spoke about Grace waking before sunrise to take the bus to work, about the apartment window that rattled whenever trucks passed on the street, about library books stacked on a milk crate beside her bed, about learning that being poor did not mean being empty. She did not make it sound sad. That was the surprising part. She made it sound honest. "My grandmother never told me to hate people who had more," Naomi said. "She told me to pay attention to what they did with it." This time, the silence was sharper. Harrison's eyes narrowed, not in anger exactly, but in discomfort. He had been praised by governors, photographed beside hospital wings, honored at luncheons where people used words like visionary and generous. Yet this little girl, standing in repaired shoes under his own foundation banner, had made generosity feel like a question instead of an answer. Naomi turned the page. Her fingers were calm now. "I used to think confidence meant walking into a room where everybody liked you. Now I think it means walking into a room where somebody has already decided you do not belong, and still remembering who sent you there." At the front table, Oliver smiled without realizing it. Vivian placed a hand on his shoulder, but even she looked unsettled. Grace opened her eyes, and they were shining. Naomi saw her grandmother then, really saw her, standing at the edge of all that wealth in her clean but faded dress, trying so hard not to cry because she did not want anyone to mistake her pride for pain. Naomi lowered the paper slightly. For a moment, she stopped reading and spoke from memory. "My grandma fixed my shoes so I could come here tonight. But she also fixed something else. She fixed my understanding of what worth means. She told me worth is not bought. It is carried. It is shown. It is how you treat someone when you think they cannot do anything for you." Harrison looked down. It lasted only a second, but several people saw it. The man who had made the room cold now seemed unsure where to place his own hands. Then, from somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, there came a faint sound, so small most guests missed it. A child's voice, distant and uncertain. Naomi heard it because she had learned to hear small things. She paused, eyes moving toward the glass doors that led to the garden corridor. Harrison frowned, annoyed by the break in rhythm. Vivian turned in her chair and suddenly stiffened. Oliver's seat was empty. For one breath, nobody moved. The empty chair beside Vivian Whitmore looked too neat, too ordinary, as if a child had not been sitting there moments before with his shoes tucked under the seat and his small fingers tracing circles on the tablecloth. Vivian's hand remained suspended over the back of the chair, her face losing color beneath the soft gold light. "Oliver," she said, not loudly, but the name slipped through the ballroom and changed everything. Harrison turned sharply. The polished calm he had worn all evening cracked at the edges. "What do you mean, Oliver?" Vivian pushed back her chair so quickly that the legs scraped against the marble. "He was right here." The event coordinator hurried toward her, clipboard bouncing against her hip, whispering into a headset that suddenly seemed too small for the size of the problem. Around the ballroom, adults began doing what adults often do when fear enters a beautiful room. They moved fast without knowing where to go. A security guard stepped toward the hallway. Another turned toward the lobby. A waiter pointed toward the elevators, though he had not seen anything. Guests stood half-risen from their seats, napkins falling, chairs shifting, voices overlapping until Naomi's essay was swallowed by confusion. "Check the restrooms," Harrison ordered, his voice hard but thinner than before. "Check the lobby. Check every exit." Caleb Reed, the family driver, appeared from near the service entrance and nodded once before moving quickly toward the front doors. Vivian pressed her hands together near her mouth. "He does not like crowds," she said. "He gets overwhelmed when there is too much noise." Harrison looked toward the stage as if the room itself had betrayed him. How could no one be watching him? No one answered. No one wanted to carry that question. Naomi stood behind the microphone, still holding her folded pages. The spotlight remained on her, but now it felt strange and lonely, a circle of brightness while fear moved in the darker edges of the ballroom. She looked at Oliver's empty chair, then at the glass doors beyond the far wall. Earlier, before Harrison had noticed her shoes, before the room had turned her into a test, Oliver had walked past the refreshment table with a little paper cup of apple juice. He had stopped near the tall windows and looked out toward the garden corridor where silver mist drifted beyond the glass. Naomi remembered his voice, quiet enough that only she and a nearby server could have heard it. "It sounds like rain in there." At the time, Naomi had thought he meant the indoor garden behind the hotel, the one with the glass ceiling and the stone fountain. That made a gentle rushing sound. She had seen it when she and Grace first arrived, past a set of double doors marked staff and event access. The garden had looked beautiful, but also slippery near the fountain, with pale stone paths shining from the spray. Naomi stepped away from the microphone. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Vivian did not hear her. She was speaking to a guard now, her voice trembling as she described Oliver's navy suit, blonde hair, and small red bow tie. Naomi came down the stage steps, her old shoes touching the marble with quick, careful taps. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said again, louder this time. Vivian turned, and in her eyes Naomi saw something she had not seen before. Not wealth, not judgment, just a mother who could not find her child. "He said the garden sounded like rain," Naomi said. Harrison's head snapped toward her. "What?" "Earlier," Naomi continued, keeping her voice steady because panic would not help Oliver. "He was looking through those doors. He said it sounded like rain in there." The event coordinator glanced toward the garden corridor and shook her head. "That area is closed during events. The floor crew uses it for access to the greenhouse and fountain system." "Is it locked?" Naomi asked. The woman hesitated. "It should be." Should be was not enough. Naomi knew that from apartment doors, bus schedules, school promises, and grown-ups who used soft words when they did not want to admit something had gone wrong. She looked past the coordinator and noticed one of the glass doors resting slightly open, just enough for a ribbon of cooler air to slide into the ballroom. The curtain beside it moved. Nobody else saw it because everyone was looking at hallways, elevators, and exits built for adults. Naomi saw it because children looked lower. Harrison followed her gaze. For the first time that night, he did not speak. Naomi started walking. Grace reached for her gently. "Naomi." Naomi turned back only long enough to say, "Grandma, I think I know where he went." Grace's face tightened with worry, but she nodded because she knew that tone. It was the same tone Naomi used when she found a lost kindergartner after school, when she noticed a stove burner left on in their building laundry room, when she saw something others missed and could not pretend she had not. Harrison moved after her. "You are not going anywhere alone." His voice sounded like an order, but not a cruel one this time. Naomi did not argue. She simply pushed through the glass door into the garden corridor. The air changed immediately. The music and voices behind them became muffled, replaced by the soft mechanical hum of the hotel's climate system and the steady whisper of water somewhere ahead. The corridor smelled of wet stone, ferns, and clean chlorine. Lights along the floor glowed pale blue, guiding a path between tall walls of glass. Naomi's shoes made a different sound here, not the crisp tap of marble, but a soft scrape against damp tile. Harrison stayed close behind her, his cane striking the floor in uneven beats. Vivian followed with the event coordinator and 2 guards, calling Oliver's name in a voice that tried very hard not to break. Naomi stopped near the turn that led into the greenhouse garden. There, at the edge of the doorway, lay a small red bow tie. Vivian covered her mouth. Harrison stared at it, as if the little piece of fabric had pulled all the power out of his body. Naomi bent down, picked it up carefully, and held it out. "He came this way," she said. Beyond the doorway, the fountain whispered louder, and somewhere inside the misty glass garden, a small voice answered, "Mom?" The small voice came from beyond the curtain of mist, thin and frightened, yet clear enough to pull every adult forward at once. Vivian gasped Oliver's name and stepped toward the greenhouse garden, but Naomi lifted one hand without looking back. "Wait," she said. The word was not loud, but something in it made even Harrison stop. Past the doorway, the garden opened into a glass-walled room filled with tall palms, ferns, white orchids, and narrow stone paths curving around a circular fountain. Water spilled from 3 bronze bowls into a shallow pool, and the hotel's misting system had filled the air with a silver haze that caught the blue floor lights and made everything look underwater. The stone around the fountain shone with moisture. Some places were dry and dull. Others gleamed like glass. Naomi saw the difference immediately. Her grandmother had once told her that poor children learn surfaces early. Wet sidewalks, loose stairs, cracked curbs, icy porch steps in January, bus floors slick with rain. You learn where to place your feet because no one was coming to carry you every time the world got slippery. Oliver stood on the far side of the fountain, close to a bench beneath a wall of hanging plants. He was safe, but scared, frozen in place with both hands gripping the edge of the bench. His red bow tie was gone, his blonde hair damp from the mist, and his eyes were huge as he stared at the floor between him and the adults. "Mom," he called again, his voice trembling. "I cannot get back." Vivian took another step, but one of the guards gently held out an arm to stop her from rushing forward. "Ma'am, the stone is wet. Let us check it first." Harrison's face tightened. "Turn the system off." The event coordinator was already pressing buttons on a wall panel, but nothing changed. The fountain kept whispering. The mist kept drifting. "It is not responding," she said, panic creeping into her professional voice. "Maintenance must have it on a separate control." Harrison turned toward the guards. "Then go get him." The taller guard started forward, but his dress shoes slid slightly on the first wet patch. He caught himself on a planter, embarrassed but unharmed, and stopped. Oliver made a small sound and pressed closer to the bench. Vivian whispered, "Please do not scare him." That was when Naomi stepped closer to the entrance, not entering yet, just looking. Her eyes moved across the floor, tracing the path like a puzzle. She could see where the mist landed most heavily near the fountain, where small dry islands remained under the overhang of plants, where the grout lines between stones offered a little texture. She could also see Oliver's problem. To an adult, the path looked simple. Walk around the fountain and return. To a frightened 6-year-old in stiff dress shoes, the wet floor looked like a lake he could not cross. Naomi knew that feeling. Not the fountain, not the fancy greenhouse, but the feeling of standing in a room where everyone expected you to move and your feet would not listen because too many eyes were watching. "Oliver," Naomi called softly. His eyes shifted toward her. "It is me, Naomi." He blinked through the mist. "The girl with the shoes?" Harrison closed his eyes for a second, as if the words themselves had turned into a mirror he did not want to face. Naomi almost smiled, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes, the girl with the shoes." "I am stuck," Oliver said. "I know," Naomi answered. "But you are not alone." Vivian pressed a hand to her chest. Grace had arrived at the doorway now, quiet and breathless, watching Naomi with fear and trust fighting across her face. "Baby," she said, barely above a whisper, "be careful." Naomi nodded once. Harrison looked at her, and for the first time that evening, there was no mockery in his face. Only urgency. "Tell us what to do," he said. The words surprised everyone, including him. Naomi looked down at her shoes. The left one had the stronger sole. The right one had the tighter laces. They were not pretty, but they had grip. They had survived sidewalks that cracked in the Georgia heat and puddles deeper than they looked after summer storms. She stepped carefully onto the first dry square, then pointed to a narrow strip of stone near a planter. "Oliver, do you see the place where the floor looks darker?" He nodded quickly. "Do not step there. Step only where it looks dull, not shiny." Oliver looked down and shook his head. "I cannot tell." Naomi glanced at the fountain, then at her own feet. An idea moved through her face, small and certain. She crouched at the doorway and untied her right shoe. Grace inhaled. Harrison stared. Naomi pulled the shoe off, held it in one hand, and placed it on the first safe dry patch between her and Oliver. Then she untied the left one and placed it on the next dry patch, farther ahead, like a marker. Standing in white socks on the cool tile near the entrance, she looked across the mist at the little boy. "Step on my shoes," she said. Oliver froze. "What?" "Only my shoes," Naomi told him. "Do not look at the water. Do not look at everyone. Look at me, then step where I put them." Harrison's voice came low and rough behind her. "Naomi, you do not have to do this." She did not turn around. "Yes, sir," she said gently. "I do." Then, moving one careful step at a time from dry stone to dry stone, Naomi began shifting the shoes forward, making a path where no one else had seen one, while the whole garden held its breath. Oliver stared at the two old brown shoes as if they were stepping stones across a river only he could see. The mist curled between him and Naomi in soft silver ribbons, and the fountain kept pouring behind him with that gentle, endless sound that had first pulled him away from the ballroom. He stood beside the bench, small in his navy suit, his socks planted on a dry patch beneath the hanging ferns, his eyes moving from the shiny stone floor to Naomi's face. "I am scared," he whispered. Vivian made a sound like she wanted to run to him, but she stayed where she was, one hand held tightly against her heart, the other gripping the doorway. Harrison stood beside her, suddenly still, suddenly older, his cane forgotten in his hand. Naomi knelt near the first shoe, her own white socks touching the cool tile at the edge of the path. "That is all right," she said. "Scared does not mean stuck forever." Oliver swallowed. "What if I fall?" Naomi shook her head gently. "Then you pause. You breathe. And you listen to me. But we are going to go slow, and you are going to step only where I tell you." The taller security guard shifted uneasily. "Miss, we should wait for maintenance." Naomi looked at the still fogging mist system, the wet stones, the little boy whose fear was growing with every extra second. "Waiting is making him more scared," she said. It was not disrespectful. It was true. Grace heard it and closed her eyes for a moment, because she knew that truth had always been Naomi's strongest voice. Harrison turned to the guard. "Let her speak." The guard stopped. So did everyone else. Naomi looked back to Oliver. "Can you lift your right foot?" Oliver nodded, but his foot did not move. Naomi smiled softly, not teasing him, not rushing him. "Just a little, like you were stepping over a pencil." Oliver tried. His shoe rose half an inch, then settled again. "Good," Naomi said immediately. "That was good. Now look at the shoe closest to you. The one with the white stitching." Oliver looked. The repaired left shoe sat on a dull patch of stone a few feet from him, pointing toward the doorway like it knew the way home. "That one?" he asked. "Yes. Put your foot right in the middle of it. Not beside it. On it." The room held its breath. Oliver reached out one hand, as if the air itself could steady him. Naomi stretched her hand toward him, but kept enough distance so he would not lean too far. "Eyes on me," she reminded him. "Not the floor." He looked at her. His little face tightened with effort. Then he stepped. His polished dress shoe landed inside Naomi's old shoe, pressing it flat against the stone. It held. Nothing happened. No slip. No stumble. Just one small boy standing one step closer to safety. Vivian let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. Harrison looked down at the shoe under Oliver's foot, and something in his expression changed so deeply that no one near him could miss it. The same shoe he had judged in the ballroom had just become the first safe place his grandson could stand. Naomi moved the second shoe forward, sliding it carefully to the next dry square. She tested the stone with 2 fingers, then nodded. Now the other one. Slow. Oliver followed. 1 step, then another. Each movement was small, almost ordinary, yet everyone watched as if they were witnessing something sacred. The fountain whispered. The orchids trembled in the mist. The blue lights glowed along the wet path. Naomi's socks grew damp near the edges, but she did not mention it. She kept moving the shoes, one after the other, building a path out of what she had been mocked for. You are doing great, she said. Just keep looking at me. Oliver's breathing grew steadier. Why are your shoes different? He asked, voice still shaky but curious now. Naomi glanced at him with a tiny smile. Because one lace broke. Why did you not get new ones? The question was innocent, and that made it heavier. In the doorway, Harrison lowered his eyes. Naomi answered without shame. Because sometimes families buy what they need first. Oliver thought about that while he stepped into the next shoe. Grandpa buys lots of things. I know, Naomi said. Her voice stayed kind. But everybody still has things to learn. Harrison heard every word. They were not thrown at him. That made them land harder. The final stretch was the narrowest part, where the fountain spray had made the stones shine almost all the way across. Naomi studied it, then looked at a large planter near the side. There was a dry strip beside it, barely wide enough for a child's foot. She placed one shoe there, then the other, angling them carefully. This is the last part, she said. When you step here, you will be close enough for your mom. Oliver looked past her and saw Vivian waiting with both hands open, tears bright on her cheeks, but her voice gentle. I am right here, sweetheart. Oliver nodded. He stepped into the first shoe, then the second. His fingers brushed Naomi's sleeve as he came close. Naomi backed up slowly, giving him room, still watching his feet. One more, she whispered. One more, Oliver. He stepped off the last shoe onto the dry tile at the doorway. Vivian reached him immediately, wrapping him in her arms with careful relief, holding him as if the whole ballroom had vanished and only he remained. Oliver buried his face against her shoulder. I followed her shoes, he said. Vivian looked over his head at Naomi, and gratitude moved across her face before she could shape it into words. Naomi bent to pick up the shoes. The leather was wet now, darker across the toes, the white stitching shining under the blue lights. She slipped them back on without complaint, though her socks were cold and damp. When she stood, Harrison Whitmore was staring at her feet. Not with disgust, not with judgment, with recognition. The garden had gone quiet except for the fountain, and in that quiet, the old shoes seemed louder than all the applause money could buy. Harrison Whitmore did not move for several seconds. He stood at the entrance of the glass garden with one hand around the handle of his cane and the other hanging at his side, staring at Naomi Brooks as if he were seeing her for the first time. The mist still drifted behind her shoulders. The old shoes were back on her feet, darker now from the damp stone, the white stitching along the left sole catching the blue light like a thin line of truth. Oliver was safe in his mother's arms. Vivian held him close, whispering words only he could hear, smoothing his hair with trembling fingers while he clung to her collar. The guard spoke quietly into their radios. The event coordinator kept apologizing to no one in particular, her clipboard pressed against her chest. But Harrison heard none of it clearly. What he heard was Naomi's sentence from the ballroom, repeating inside him with a force he could not dismiss. To speak, sir, not to be laughed at. He looked at the child he had mocked in front of a room full of donors, and then at the grandson who had followed those same shoes back from fear. Something inside him, something stiff and polished and praised for too many years, began to give way. Grace Brooks reached Naomi first. She did not make a scene. She simply knelt in front of her granddaughter, checked her face, then her hands, then looked at the damp shoes. Are you all right, baby? Naomi nodded. I am okay, Grandma. Grace touched the side of Naomi's cheek with the back of her fingers, a gesture so gentle Harrison had to look away. He had built hotels with marble lobbies, foundations with gold-lettered banners, speeches with words like opportunity and promise, but he could not remember the last time he had looked at a child and asked what the child needed before deciding what the child represented. Vivian finally lifted her face. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady enough to carry across the garden. Naomi, she said, Thank you. Naomi looked down, not because she was ashamed, but because gratitude from grown-ups sometimes felt too large to hold. I just helped him step back, she said. Oliver turned his head from his mother's shoulder. She made a path, he whispered, with her shoes. The words seemed to move through everyone. Caleb Reed, who had arrived breathless from checking the lobby, stopped near the doorway and took off his cap. One of the guards looked. At the floor, the event coordinator pressed her lips together, fighting emotion. Harrison felt his throat tighten, and for once, he did not know how to turn that feeling into authority. He stepped forward slowly, each tap of his cane softer than the last. Naomi noticed him coming and stood a little straighter. Grace rose beside her, protective but calm. Harrison stopped a few feet away. Earlier that evening, he had towered over Naomi with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Now the space between them felt different. Not smaller, but more honest. Miss Brooks, he began. His voice sounded rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, but that did not fix it. Naomi. She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, not angry, and somehow that made it harder. Yes, sir. Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it. The apology he would have offered in a boardroom came too easily to mind. Regrettable comment. Unfortunate misunderstanding. Standards poorly expressed. He knew those phrases. He had paid people to write them. None of them belonged here. Not in front of a child with wet shoes and more courage than he had shown in his own ballroom. He lowered himself slowly onto one knee, not dramatically, not to make the moment about himself, but because speaking to her from above suddenly felt wrong. A quiet shock moved through the people around them. Harrison Whitmore did not kneel. Not for photographers. Not for politicians. Not for anyone. Yet there he was on the damp tile, his tuxedo close to the mist, his silver head bowed slightly before a 9-year-old girl. I was wrong, he said. The garden stilled. Naomi did not answer. Harrison looked at her shoes, then back at her face. I was wrong about your shoes. I was wrong about what they meant. And worse than that, I was wrong about you. His voice nearly broke on the final word, and the sound of it seemed to loosen something in Grace's expression. Naomi's fingers curled around the side of her dress. Harrison continued, slower now. You walked into my event with dignity, and I treated dignity like it needed permission from me. Then you used the very thing I mocked to bring my grandson back safely. Oliver watched over his mother's shoulder, listening with wide eyes. Harrison turned slightly toward him, then back to Naomi. There is no excuse for that. Not my age. Not my name. Not my money. Nothing. Naomi studied him. In stories, grown-ups sometimes changed in a single sentence, but Naomi knew real change had weight. She had seen people say sorry because they were embarrassed, not because they understood. She had seen apologies used like napkins, wiping away messes without cleaning anything underneath. So she asked the question her grandmother had taught her to ask without ever speaking it aloud. What are you going to do now? Harrison blinked. Around them, the adults seemed startled by the courage of it. Grace did not stop her. A small proud smile trembled at the corner of her mouth. Harrison looked at Naomi for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if she had asked the only question that mattered. First, he said, I am going to walk back into that ballroom and apologize where I insulted you. Not here in private. There, in front of every person who heard me. Vivian closed her eyes with relief. Caleb looked toward the ballroom doors, already understanding. Harrison slowly stood, leaning on his cane, but when he was upright, something about him was less heavy than before. He turned toward the corridor. Second, he said, I am going to listen to the rest of your speech, if you are willing to finish it. Naomi looked at Grace. Grace looked back with eyes shining under the garden lights. That is your choice, baby. Naomi looked down at her damp shoes, at the old leather that had carried her into shame and then into purpose. Then she lifted her chin. I will finish, she said. Harrison nodded once. Then let us go back. As they walked toward the ballroom, the sounds of the gala returned slowly, muffled voices, shifting chairs, the anxious murmur of people waiting to learn what had happened. Naomi walked beside her grandmother. Harrison walked a few steps behind them, not leading this time. And for the first time all evening, everyone who saw Naomi enter the room looked at her shoes not as something poor, but as something powerful. When Naomi stepped back into the ballroom, the room did not return to normal. It could not. The chandeliers still glowed. The white roses still lined the stage. The grand piano still sat near the wall with its polished lid reflecting the lights. But the air had changed, and everyone inside felt it before they understood why. Conversations faded one by one as Naomi entered beside Grace. Her blue dress smooth except for the places where the garden mist had touched the hem, her braids still neat, her white beads clicking softly with each step. Then came Vivian with Oliver in her arms, his face tucked against her shoulder, safe and quiet. A wave of relief moved through the guests, low and breathless. Some people pressed hands to their hearts. Others whispered his name. But the strongest silence followed Harrison Whitmore. He entered last, no longer moving like the owner of the room, though technically he was. His cane tapped the marble in slow measured beats, and every eye turned toward him. A few donors stood as if waiting for him to explain that everything was under control, that the program would resume, that the little disturbance had been handled. Harrison saw those faces, the familiar faces of people who trusted him to make discomfort disappear. For most of his life, that had been one of his talents. He could turn mistakes into statements, failures into strategy, cruelty into preference, and distance into dignity. But not tonight. Not after watching a child turn her old shoes into a path for his grandson. Not after hearing Oliver whisper, "She made a path," with her shoes. Naomi reached the stage steps and paused. She was ready to return to the microphone, but Harrison lifted one hand gently. "Please," he said, his voice carrying without the microphone. "Before Miss Brooks continues, I need to speak." The room became completely still. Grace stood beside Naomi at the foot of the stage, close enough that Naomi could feel her presence without needing to look. Vivian sat in the front row now, holding Oliver on her lap, her arms wrapped around him with the kind of careful relief that made even strangers look away respectfully. Harrison walked to the center of the ballroom instead of the stage. That choice mattered. On the stage, he would have looked like the host. On the floor, he looked like a man standing where his mistake had begun. He turned slowly, taking in the tables, the donors, the staff, the young scholarship students along the side wall, and finally Naomi. "A little while ago," he said, "I made a comment about Miss Brooks's shoes." No one moved. A woman near the front lowered her eyes. The man in the gray suit shifted in his chair. Harrison continued, "I said those shoes did not belong in this room." His voice remained steady, but it no longer had the cold polish from earlier. There was weight in it now. "I said it because I was looking at the outside of a child and pretending I was seeing her worth." Naomi held her folded essay against her dress. She did not smile. She did not soften the moment for him. She simply listened. Harrison turned toward her fully. Naomi Brooks walked into this ballroom with more courage than many adults ever bring into rooms like this. She stood under judgment she did not deserve. She answered with dignity. And when my grandson needed help, she was the one who noticed what the rest of us missed. A quiet ripple passed through the room. Guests looked at Naomi's shoes now, damp and repaired, resting on the marble as if they had always belonged there. Harrison's eyes followed theirs, and he nodded slightly. The same shoes I mocked became the guide that helped Oliver return safely to his mother. Vivian pressed her lips together, tears shining again, while Oliver turned his head and looked at Naomi from his mother's lap. Harrison took a breath. "So I will say this clearly. I was wrong. I was not misunderstood. I was not taken out of context. I was wrong." The honesty of it struck the room harder than any excuse could have. Several guests sat back as if the words had pushed them gently into themselves. Grace looked at Harrison with guarded respect, the kind that did not arrive quickly but recognized effort when it appeared. Naomi's fingers loosened around her paper. Harrison faced the crowd again. "If any of you laughed, nearly laughed, stayed silent because it felt easier, or decided this child's value by what she wore, then my mistake was not mine alone." That sentence moved through the ballroom like a slow opening door. It did not accuse with anger. It invited shame to become responsibility. The woman in pearls wiped the corner of her eye. The gray-suited man looked directly at Naomi for the first time, not as a spectacle, but as a child he should have defended. Harrison stepped toward the stage and stopped a few feet from Naomi. He did not touch her. He did not perform tenderness for the room. He simply lowered his voice, though everyone still heard. "Miss Brooks, I apologize to you. I apologize to your grandmother. And I apologize for making you prove what should have been respected from the beginning." Naomi looked at Grace. Grace gave the smallest nod, not telling her what to feel, only reminding her that she had permission to feel it. Naomi turned back to Harrison. "Thank you for saying it where everyone could hear," she said. The room inhaled around her. Harrison bowed his head once. "You were right to ask what I would do now." Then he looked toward the event coordinator. "Please adjust the microphone for Miss Brooks." The coordinator moved quickly, her hands careful this time, almost reverent. Naomi climbed the stage steps again. Her shoes made that same small sound, but no one heard poverty in it anymore. They heard distance traveled. They heard courage carried through embarrassment, mist, fear, and return. When Naomi reached the microphone, she unfolded her essay. For a second, she looked out at the ballroom that had nearly swallowed her voice and found it waiting now, not perfectly, not innocently, but differently. Oliver lifted one small hand from the front row. Naomi gave him a tiny nod. Then she looked at Grace, whose eyes were shining beneath the chandelier light. Naomi took a breath, steady and clear. "My grandmother says tomorrow is not something rich people own and poor people wait for," she began again. "Tomorrow is something we build with what we have." This time, no spoon touched a plate. No one whispered. No one looked away. Harrison Whitmore stood at the side of the stage with his cane held in both hands, listening like a man who had finally understood that a child's voice did not need his permission to matter. Naomi's voice did not rise, yet it filled the ballroom in a way that no microphone could fully explain. It moved over the white roses, the linen-covered tables, the polished silver forks, the glasses of sparkling water no one reached for anymore. She read about mornings when the Atlanta sky was still dark and Grace Brooks was already tying her work shoes. About evenings when Naomi did homework at the kitchen table while her grandmother counted bills with a pencil behind her ear. About the way Grace never called sacrifice by its name because she did not want Naomi growing up believing love was a burden. "My grandmother says the world will often ask children like me to be grateful for being allowed inside," Naomi said, looking down at her paper, then up at the crowd. "But she also says there is a difference between being allowed inside and being welcomed." The sentence landed quietly, but it landed everywhere. Harrison stood beside the stage, his hands folded over the top of his cane, feeling each word settle into places in him that had been untouched for years. He had funded schools but rarely visited classrooms. He had signed checks for children whose names he never learned. He had built a foundation that used the word future while letting a child stand in front of him as if her present did not matter. Across the front row, Oliver listened with his head resting against Vivian's shoulder. His eyes were heavy from fear and relief, but whenever Naomi spoke, he opened them again. Grace sat near the aisle now, both hands clasped in her lap, her face lifted toward her granddaughter with a kind of pride that made the expensive room seem suddenly small. Naomi turned the final page of her essay. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the size of the moment. "When I grow up," she read, "I do not want to be important because people recognize my last name. I want to be useful because someone recognizes my kindness. I want to build something that opens doors without checking shoes first. I want to remember that a person can be tired and still be proud, poor and still be generous, overlooked and still be brave." A woman near the back covered her mouth. One of the scholarship students standing along the wall wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The event coordinator, still holding her bent clipboard, stopped pretending she was only managing a program and simply listened. Naomi looked at Harrison then, not to punish him, not to win, but because her essay had somehow reached the place where his mistake lived. "My grandma says old shoes can still walk someone home," Naomi said. "And I think she is right." For a second, nothing happened. No applause, no music, no polite movement. The room held the sentence as if touching it too quickly might break it. Then Grace stood. She did not clap loudly. She simply brought her hands together once, twice, with tears shining on her cheeks. Oliver followed with small claps from his mother's lap. Then Vivian. Then the scholarship students. Then the waiters along the wall, the guests at the front tables, the woman in pearls, the gray-suited man. And finally, the whole ballroom rose into a standing ovation that did not sound polished at all. It sounded human. Naomi stood beneath the spotlight, her old shoes planted firmly on the stage, her essay resting against her dress. She looked surprised for only a moment. Then she found her grandmother in the crowd and smiled. Harrison did not clap at first. He could not. He was too busy understanding that applause was the smallest thing the room owed her. When he finally brought his hands together, the sound felt less like praise and more like confession. After the applause faded, Harrison stepped toward the microphone, but he did not take it from Naomi. He looked at her first. "May I speak for a moment?" Naomi nodded. He turned to the guests. "This foundation was created in my family's name," he said. "Tonight, a child reminded me that a name on a banner means nothing if the heart behind it stays closed." His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "So I am changing more than my words. Starting tonight, the Whitmore Children's Future Foundation will create a permanent scholarship program for students who are judged too quickly because of what they wear, where they live, what they can afford, or what others assume about them before they speak." Murmurs rose, but this time they were warm, startled, awake. Harrison looked at Grace. "Mrs. Brooks, with your permission and Naomi's, I would like the first scholarship to carry her name. Not as charity, as a reminder. The Naomi Step Scholarship." Grace's lips parted, and for a moment she looked not at Harrison, but at Naomi, because nothing involving Naomi would be decided over Naomi. Naomi's eyes widened. "My name?" Harrison nodded. "Because tonight you showed us what it means to keep walking with dignity." Naomi looked down at her shoes. They were still damp from the garden, still old, still stitched in white thread by the hands of the woman who had loved her through every hard season. Then she looked at Oliver, who smiled shyly from the front row. "Can it help other kids too?" she asked. Harrison's answer came without hesitation. "That is the point." Naomi thought about that, then nodded once. Then yes. The room applauded again, softer this time, less like celebration and more like agreement. Harrison stepped back from the microphone and faced Naomi. He did not tower, did not perform, did not try to turn her courage into his redemption too quickly. He simply said, "Thank you for teaching me." Naomi tilted her head, thoughtful in the way only children can be when they have seen adults at their worst and are deciding whether to believe their best. "My grandma taught me first," she said. A gentle laugh moved through the room, warm and relieved. Grace pressed a hand over her heart. Harrison looked toward her and bowed his head. "Then I thank your grandmother, too." Outside the ballroom, beyond the glass doors, the garden fountain kept whispering in the distance. But inside, under the chandelier light, something else had begun moving, quieter than applause and stronger than embarrassment. It was the sound of a room learning how to see a child clearly. By the time the gala ended, the Langford Grand Hotel no longer felt like the same building Naomi had entered that evening. The chandeliers still glittered above the marble floor, and the white roses still framed the stage, but the room had lost the cold shine that made people measure one another from a distance. Guests who had barely looked at Naomi before now stepped aside with a quiet respect that did not ask her to perform gratitude. Some spoke to Grace, not with pity, but with attention. A school principal from East Atlanta asked Naomi about her favorite books. A woman who ran a community tutoring program gave Grace her card and said she would like to visit Naomi's school, not for photographs, but to listen. Even the man in the gray suit approached slowly, his face red with embarrassment, and told Naomi he should have spoken up earlier. Naomi did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded, because her grandmother had taught her that forgiveness did not have to be rushed just because someone finally found the courage to apologize. Oliver stayed close to Vivian, but every few minutes, he glanced toward Naomi as if checking that she was still there. Near the ballroom doors, Harrison Whitmore stood apart from the crowd, watching his staff roll away the podium and fold the navy stage curtains. For the first time in many years, he did not feel proud of how grand the evening had looked. He felt responsible for what it had revealed. When Naomi and Grace prepared to leave, Grace carrying Naomi's essay carefully inside her purse so it would not wrinkle, Harrison walked toward them with Caleb Reed beside him. Caleb held a small hotel towel folded over one arm, not fancy, not wrapped in ribbon, just clean and warm from the laundry room. Harrison stopped at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "Naomi, may I offer you a ride home?" Grace looked at him carefully. The same man who had shamed her granddaughter an hour earlier was now standing before them with humility in his posture. But Grace had lived long enough to know that one emotional night did not erase a lifetime of assumptions. "We came by bus," she said. "We can get home by bus." Harrison nodded. "I understand." He looked at Naomi's shoes, then quickly back to her face, as if he had learned not to let his eyes speak before his heart did. Then may I at least have the hotel prepare dry socks for her before you go? Grace softened at that. Naomi looked down and realized her socks were still cold inside her damp shoes, though she had been too full of the evening to notice. That would be okay, Grace said. Caleb stepped forward and handed the towel to Grace, then quietly asked a staff member for children's socks from the hotel shop. No one made a spectacle of it. That mattered. While they waited near the lobby's tall windows, Oliver came over holding Vivian's hand. In his other hand was the little red bow tie Naomi had found in the garden. He looked at Naomi shyly. I am going to keep it in my drawer, he said. So I remember not to wander off. Vivian smiled softly. And to remember who helped you. Oliver nodded. Then he looked at Naomi's shoes. Can I ask you something? Naomi tilted her head. Yes. Do you think old shoes get tired? Naomi thought about it seriously, because Oliver had asked seriously. Maybe, she said. But I think they like knowing they still matter. Oliver seemed to accept that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver race car, the kind wealthy children carry without thinking about its price. He held it out, then hesitated. You do not have to take it. I just want you to have something of mine since I stepped on something of yours. Naomi looked at Grace, and Grace gave a small nod. Naomi accepted the car with both hands. Thank you, she said. I will keep it safe. Harrison watched the exchange, and the simplicity of it humbled him more than the applause had. Children understood restoration faster than adults. They did not need committees to know when kindness had passed from one hand to another. The next morning, rain washed the streets of Atlanta clean. In the lobby of Whitmore Properties, Harrison arrived without his usual line of assistants behind him. He carried a plain folder and asked for the foundation board to gather before lunch. By noon, the gold-lettered gala language had been replaced by work that could be measured. The Naomi Step Scholarship would not be a one-night promise. It would cover shoes, coats, school supplies, transportation, tutoring, and emergency family support for children across the city who were often told, directly or quietly, that they did not belong. Harrison insisted that Grace Brooks be invited to advise the program, with compensation for her time, because wisdom should never be taken for free simply because it came from someone poor. When the first announcement went out weeks later, Naomi stood beside Grace in the auditorium of her public elementary school, wearing the same blue dress and the same brown shoes, now cleaned and dried, still old, still stitched. Harrison stood nearby, but not in the center. He had asked not to be the first speaker. Naomi was. She looked out at rows of children, parents, teachers, and local reporters, then down at the shoes that had carried her through humiliation, courage, and change. These are not magic shoes, she said. My grandmother fixed them. I walked in them. Oliver trusted them. Mr. Whitmore learned from them. That is not magic. That is what happens when people stop looking down on someone and start looking closer. Grace wiped her eyes with a tissue. Harrison bowed his head. Somewhere in the front row, Oliver held his red bow tie in one hand and clapped with the other. Naomi smiled, and this time the room did not feel too big for her. It felt like a place her voice could live. Years later, people would still talk about that night at the Langford Grand Hotel, but Naomi would remember smaller things. The sound of her beads clicking when she stood tall, the cold tile beneath her socks, her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, Oliver's careful step into the shoe with the white stitching, and the moment a powerful man finally understood that worth was not something he could grant. It had been there all along. A person's future was never hidden in polished leather, designer labels, or perfect appearances. Sometimes it waited quietly in repaired shoes, in brave feet, in a child who kept walking when the whole room expected her to stop.